I was 62 years old, dressed in a sensible navy suit, sitting across the table from the man who had been my husband for 4 decades, preparing to battle him in open court. My lawyer, a brilliant young woman named Sophia, patted my hand, but her confidence barely registered. All I could think about was the 40 years I had spent crafting Richard's perfect life, only to realize I had sacrificed every single piece of my own in the process. Richard, seated with his expensive, self-satisfied lawyer, had that familiar smirk plastered on his face, the one that said, "I know something you don't, and I already won." He fully expected this divorce hearing to be a formality, a quick dismissal. Why wouldn't he? I had no independent career, no separate assets, and no financial footing outside the empire he had built. But let me take you back, because to understand the cold silence that filled that courtroom, you have to understand the slow, suffocating burn of Richard's control. When we married, I was 22, fresh out of college, eager to start a life centered around art and travel. Richard was ambitious, charming, and insistent. "Darling Margaret," he'd said, "the world needs great men to lead, and you are the anchor that will allow me to conquer it. Your dreams can wait, mine can't." And they did wait. For 40 years, I dedicated myself to being Mrs. Richard, hostess, decorator, personal assistant, and unpaid financial manager of the household accounts, which, crucially, were all tethered to his primary business accounts. He was generous in theory. We lived in a stunning house, drove luxury cars, and I never had to ask for money for groceries or clothes. The catch? Everything was contingent on his approval. I once suggested setting up a small savings account in just my name, a tiny, modest nest egg, just in case. Richard laughed, a deep, booming sound that always managed to sound amused and dismissive simultaneously. "Margaret, why would you need a separate account? We are a partnership. A unit. Everything I have is yours, and everything you have is mine. You don't trust me, darling?" It wasn't about trust, it was about autonomy. But Richard framed every request for independence as a threat to the marriage. His favorite phrase, which became the soundtrack of my life, was, "I take care of you, Margaret. Don't worry your pretty little head about the details." His entitlement grew like a weed in rich soil. Over the years, I stopped painting. The easel was banished to the dusty attic because the smell of oil paint bothered Richard's sinuses. I stopped joining book clubs because Richard insisted I needed to be home in case an important client called. My identity slowly eroded until I was merely an extension of his status. The final, devastating crack came 3 months before I filed for divorce. My sister, Dorothy, was in town for a rare visit. Dorothy understood me. She remembered the Margaret who carried sketchbooks instead of designer handbags. We planned a simple Tuesday lunch at a cafe 20 minutes from the house. I was genuinely excited, a pure, unadulterated joy I hadn't felt in years. I mentioned it to Richard while he was reading the financial papers at the breakfast table. "Richard, I'm meeting Dorothy for lunch Tuesday. Just a couple of hours." The paper didn't drop, but his jaw tightened. "A couple of hours? Margaret, are you serious?" I frowned. "Yes. We haven't seen each other properly since Christmas." Richard tossed the paper onto the mahogany table, the sound sharp and aggressive. He looked at me not with anger, but with profound disappointment, as if I had failed a key performance review. "Margaret, this is exactly the kind of scatterbrained behavior I've tried to shield you from. Tuesday is when the landscapers come. I specifically told you to oversee the placement of those new rose bushes. If you're gallivanting around with Dorothy, who is going to ensure the job is done correctly? It will be substandard, and then I have to waste my time fixing it." His entire focus wasn't the roses, it was the disruption of his schedule and the fact that I had made a decision without consulting his agenda. "Richard, they are rose bushes. The landscaper knows where to put them. I just want to see my sister." He pushed his chair back, standing up slowly, towering over me. His voice dropped to the smooth, controlled baritone he used when he was about to deliver a verdict. "No, Margaret. You are not going. It is irresponsible. Furthermore, Dorothy is a terrible influence. She is always filling your head with silly notions about self-expression and finding yourself. You are my wife. Yourself is here, caring for our home, ensuring my peace, and managing my affairs. He walked past me and paused, placing a heavy, controlling hand on my shoulder. You know, I worry about you, Margaret. You've become forgetful lately. Misplacing your phone, forgetting Tuesday's obligations. Perhaps you need to spend less time worrying about frivolous lunches and more time focusing on your mental clarity. Don't push yourself too hard. He kissed the top of my head, a gesture that felt less like affection and more like ownership, and walked out the door toward his waiting driver. I stood there in the silent kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. He hadn't just forbidden the lunch, he had subtly, cruelly, weaponized my age and vulnerability, suggesting that any desire for personal freedom was a symptom of mental decline. In that moment, standing by the very table where I had served him breakfast for 40 years, the devastating realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I wasn't his partner. I was his possession. And the only way to regain my life was to burn his perfect world down around us. The realization that Richard was willing to destroy my relationships and undermine my sanity just to maintain control was the absolute, crushing betrayal that finally gave me the courage to call a lawyer. The force of that betrayal, rather than crushing me, solidified my spine. Richard had given me a new, terrifying focus. He thought he was preparing the groundwork to have me institutionalized or declared incompetent if I ever stepped out of line. I was not going to give him the satisfaction. I immediately adopted the gray rock method. Sophia, the young lawyer I eventually reached out to, discreetly, from a burner phone bought 20 miles away, confirmed it was the only way to proceed. Richard was a textbook narcissist, confrontation fed him, drama justified his rage. To survive until I could leave, I needed to become utterly boring. Over the next 6 weeks, I ceased being Margaret, the frustrated wife. I became Mrs. Richard, the competent, bland machine. When Richard came home that Tuesday night, expecting an apology or, at minimum, a sullen pout regarding the forbidden lunch, he was met with nothing. "Margaret, are you all right?" he asked over dinner, fishing for a reaction. "Perfectly fine, Richard. Just tired." "Long day overseeing the roses," I replied, my voice smooth and neutral. I didn't meet his gaze for too long, just long enough to assure him I was present, but not engaged. He tried a few more tactics. He attempted to bait me by complaining about my cooking, only to have me respond with, "I will adjust the recipe immediately for tomorrow, Richard. Thank you for the feedback." He tried to charm me with an expensive bracelet, which I accepted with a placid, non-committal "how thoughtful," before placing it in my jewelry box without comment. He was confused. His primary source of emotional supply, my worry, my anxiety, my attempts to please him, had dried up. He kept trying to poke the rock, but the rock didn't move. He became increasingly annoyed, but never suspicious. He interpreted my apathy as evidence of the very mental fog he had diagnosed, a sign that his control was tightening, not slipping. Behind that facade of compliant boredom, I was executing a meticulous plan devised with Sophia. My first task was gathering evidence, which proved difficult. Richard had locked down every digital account. But there was one thing he underestimated: the sheer volume of old, forgotten technology in a 40-year marriage. In the dusty corner of the attic, behind the long-abandoned easel, I found an old media tablet that Jennifer, my daughter, had used years ago before upgrading. I recalled that the microphone had always been hypersensitive, sometimes recording conversations accidentally. I charged it up. The sound quality was poor, but the device still functioned. I started leaving the tablet in strategic places, sometimes near the den when Richard was on a confidential business call, sometimes near the phone in the kitchen when he spoke to his lawyers or business partners. It required immense patience. I would retrieve it hours later, hoping for something, anything. Most of the recordings were useless: the noise of the cleaning staff, the television, or the ticking of the grandfather clock. But slowly, painstakingly, I began to capture fragments of Richard's true character. One night, the tablet, tucked beneath a cushion on the porch, captured a conversation Richard was having with his accountant, Frank, after several whiskeys. Asterisk, I need to make sure Margaret understands how dependent she is on me, Frank. I told her I'm worried about her memory issues. Just establishing a baseline, you understand? If this divorce gets ugly, I need a preemptive strike. Asterisk another recording, captured during a call with his primary physician, was even more chilling. Asterisk Richard asterisk, yes, doctor, I know she's fine, but she's becoming erratic. Can we get some paperwork started, something, anything, that suggests early-stage senility? Just a preliminary assessment to protect my assets. No, I'm not saying she needs care yet. I just need leverage. I need the court to see her as emotionally unstable. I listened to these snippets in the dead of night, wearing headphones so no sound escaped. Each recording was a shard of ice confirming the truth. Richard wasn't worried about my health, he was orchestrating my demise. He wasn't just controlling, he was malicious. I saved every usable audio file onto a small flash drive, labeling them numerically, meticulously documenting the date and time. I also began copying every email I could access, even old family photos, to ensure he couldn't weaponize them later. The psychological toll was heavy. Pretending to be the obedient, mentally frail wife while simultaneously plotting the destruction of the man I had lived with for 4 decades was exhausting. But every time my resolve wavered, I remembered his condescending hand on my shoulder, his voice telling me I was forgetful and disposable. That memory was the fuel. The day came 6 weeks later. Richard was traveling to Tokyo for a conference, a trip he had planned weeks in advance, granting me a perfect, 72-hour window. The plan was enacted with surgical precision. I packed 3 suitcases, one for essential documents and evidence, the flash drive, copied financial statements, one for clothes, and one filled with my old, dusty art supplies. Everything else, the house, the cars, the jewelry, was just his collateral. Jennifer arrived in the moving van precisely at 8 a.m., along with Lily, my sharp, perceptive 12-year-old granddaughter. Lily looked at the opulent prison I was leaving and then at me, dressed in my old, comfortable jeans and a simple sweater. She didn't say much, just gave me a hug that felt like steel scaffolding. "Ready, Grandma?" Jennifer asked, her eyes wet but determined. I paused in the grand foyer. 40 years of my life stood in those walls. But it wasn't my life, it was a museum dedicated to Richard's achievements. "Ready," I affirmed. We drove away, leaving a note on Richard's mahogany desk confirming that divorce papers were being served that afternoon. I arrived at Jennifer's smaller, livelier home. The air smelled of crayons and fresh laundry, not polished wood and Richard's expensive cologne. The freedom hit me like a rush of cold oxygen. For the first time in 40 years, I could choose where to sit, what to eat, and most importantly, what to think, without consulting my husband. The time living with Jennifer and Lily before the actual court date was a necessary, healing balm. Lily, fascinated by the legal preparations, started going through the digital files on the old tablet, helping me sort the garbled audio files from the clear ones. It was during this review that she discovered Richard's files were far more extensive than I realized. He had saved every digital conversation on that old cloud account, including a draft document detailing his strategy to claim I was suffering from early-stage dementia. The weeks passed, and I rediscovered the joy of painting, not in the dusty attic, but at Jennifer's kitchen table, with Lily sketching beside me. I was Margaret again, preparing not just for a court battle, but for a new beginning. Then, the morning of the hearing arrived. I sat in the navy suit, feeling the controlled anxiety of the fight ahead, Sophia beside me, Richard across the aisle, his arrogant smirk confirming that he was about to unleash his fabricated evidence. He had underestimated the gray rock, now, he was about to underestimate my granddaughter. The courtroom was a study in beige and anxiety. Above the bench, the seal of the county seemed to stare down, judging not just the facts, but the decades of unspoken misery. Judge Morrison, a woman known for her keen intellect and zero patience for melodrama, entered and the room stood. As we settled back down, Richard glanced over, his eyes lingering on my navy suit. It wasn't a look of affection or even malice, it was proprietorship. You are wearing the clothes I paid for, in a suit I approve of, fighting a battle I already won. That look, more than any verbal abuse, crystallized 40 years of bondage. Beside me, Sophia squeezed my arm one last time. Remember, Margaret, just the truth. Let him talk himself into a corner. But Richard wasn't interested in corners. He was interested in bulldozing. His lawyer, a man whose expensive silk tie seemed to be choking him, began with a smooth, practiced opening. He painted a picture of Richard, the devoted, successful, self-made man, forced to endure the sudden, inexplicable mental deterioration of his wife. The narrative began exactly where I predicted, with Richard's carefully cultivated lie. Your Honor, Richard's lawyer purred, my client, Mr. Richard, did everything a devoted husband could do. He provided security, stability, and an opulent lifestyle. Yet, 3 months ago, Mrs. Margaret, without warning or clear reason, abandoned the marital home, leaving behind a note suggesting she was seeking fulfillment. Tragically, this erratic behavior is not new. He then submitted the first piece of fabricated evidence, an assessment from a private physician Richard had chosen, alleging symptoms of mild cognitive impairment. He cited the time I forgot the landscaper's appointment, the supposed increase in my scatterbrained behavior, and even my newfound interest in art as signs of instability. I watched Richard during this presentation. He sat forward, his hand resting solicitously on his chest, looking like a man tormented by a difficult but necessary decision. He had perfected the mask of the concerned caregiver. It made my blood run ice cold. Mr. Richard, Your Honor, has grave concerns regarding Mrs. Margaret's ability to manage not only her finances, but also her independence. We respectfully suggest a structured division of assets, placing the majority of financial control with Mr. Richard, ensuring that Mrs. Margaret's basic needs are met without jeopardizing the security of the marital estate, which, we must remember, was entirely created through Mr. Richard's business acumen. He had the paperwork to back it up, doctored records, selectively cropped emails, and the physician's report. Richard had spent years building the foundation for this moment. It was a masterpiece of legal and emotional manipulation. The judge, stern and unblinking, turned to Sophia. Ms. Martinez, your response to the alleged medical concerns? Sophia stood, her voice strong despite the intimidating pile of documents on the opposing table. Your Honor, these are baseless, fabricated accusations intended to discredit my client and deny her fair access to assets accrued during a 40-year marriage. Mrs. Margaret is sharp, capable, and perfectly healthy. This is a classic case of financial abuse masked as paternalistic concern. We spent the next hour batting away Richard's allegations. Sophia did admirably, but the sheer weight of Richard's documentation, especially the financial reports showing my zero earning history, was oppressive. Every time I was mentioned as financially illiterate or mentally vulnerable, Richard would subtly shake his head, a gesture of faux sadness and deep concern. I was fighting the urge to rise up and scream the truth, but I maintained the gray rock. I kept my face blank, my hand steady on the table. But beneath the surface, the injustice was burning. Richard was successfully painting me as the disposable, defective part of his life. During a brief recess as Judge Morrison reviewed the medical filings, Richard walked past our table, ostensibly heading for the restroom. He paused just long enough for me to catch a few words. He leaned down, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, his scent of expensive cologne overwhelming me. You really should have just stayed home, Margaret. Now look at the trouble you've caused. When this is over, perhaps you can live with Dorothy. She's poor, but at least she's simple enough for you to handle. He gave a small, cruel smile. You were never truly independent, dear. You just couldn't admit it. He walked away, satisfied that he had delivered the final psychological punch. He didn't see me make eye contact with Jennifer, who was seated in the front row of the gallery, next to Lily. Lily, perched slightly forward on the bench, held a large, innocuous-looking binder. I didn't need to speak, she knew the moment had arrived. We had rehearsed this. The rules of evidence were tight, but Sophia had found a small, crucial loophole regarding electronically discovered files, especially those suggesting potential criminal activity, like fraud. When the judge returned and the hearing resumed, Richard's lawyer pressed on the central point, Margaret's lack of contribution. "We simply ask, Your Honor, how can a woman who hasn't earned $1 in 40 years demand half of an empire she did not build? She is unstable, she is incapable, and she is frankly attempting to bankrupt a legitimate enterprise based on a sudden, impulsive decision." It was my turn to take the stand. I walked to the witness box, feeling the weight of 4 decades of silenced ambition. I answered Sophia's initial questions calmly, confirming the timeline of the marriage, the lack of separate accounts, and Richard's controlling patterns. Then, Sophia took a deep breath, preparing to launch the defense's first countermove, a move that did not involve me directly, but the brilliant young woman in the gallery. "Your Honor," Sophia stated, addressing the bench, "before we continue with Mrs. Margaret's testimony, we have discovered new evidence, electronic recordings obtained from a marital device, that speak directly to Mr. Richard's intent and the veracity of these so-called medical reports. This evidence was secured by Mrs. Margaret's granddaughter, Lily, who is present in the courtroom today." Richard, who had been leaning back in his chair with supreme confidence, stiffened. He shot a look of pure menace toward Lily. Lily didn't flinch. She simply opened the binder. The trap was sprung. The moment of truth, fueled by my quiet resolve and my granddaughter's bravery, was finally upon us. The courtroom silence thickened, wrapping around Richard like a shroud. Judge Morrison looked down at the tablet Lily was connecting to a speaker on the counsel table, her expression neutral but intensely watchful. "Ms. Martinez," the judge asked, her voice sharp, "please establish the chain of custody for this device and confirm the nature of these recordings." Sophia was prepared. "Your Honor, the device belongs to the family. The files were discovered by Mrs. Margaret and her granddaughter, Lily, and primarily pertain to conversations Mr. Richard had regarding the manipulation of assets and, critically, the creation of false medical documentation to render Mrs. Margaret incapable of handling her own affairs." Richard's expensive tie suddenly looked too tight. He leaned across the table and hissed something to his own lawyer, a word I couldn't make out, but the desperation in his face was palpable. The mask of the concerned husband had begun to flicker. Judge Morrison gave a curt nod. "If these recordings speak to the veracity of the evidence already submitted, I will allow them. Proceed." Lily pressed play on the tablet. The small speaker crackled, and then Richard's voice, tinny, muffled, but unequivocally his, filled the silent courtroom. It was the conversation with his accountant, Frank, captured on the porch after several whiskeys. "I need to make sure Margaret understands how dependent she is on me, Frank. I told her I'm worried about her memory issues. Just establishing a baseline, you understand? If this divorce gets ugly, I need a preemptive strike." A collective gasp went through the small gallery. Richard bolted upright, his color draining instantly. His lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. This is out of context." "Sustained on context," Judge Morrison said, holding up a hand. "But I will hear the relevance." "Continue, Ms. Martinez." Sophia didn't wait. "The relevance, Your Honor, is the demonstrated intent to systematically undermine Mrs. Margaret's confidence and financial footing based on fabricated mental decline. Now, we move to the fabrication itself." Lily advanced the recording. The tablet emitted the scratchy sound of a phone connecting. This was Richard's call with his primary physician, the chilling one where he directly requested fraudulent paperwork. Richard *, "Yes, doctor, I know she's fine, but she's becoming erratic. Can we get some paperwork started, anything, that suggests early-stage senility? Just a preliminary assessment to protect my assets." No, I'm not saying she needs care yet. I just need leverage. I need the court to see her as emotionally unstable." The last sentence hung in the air, a devastating pronouncement of his malice. Richard wasn't simply controlling, he was attempting criminal fraud against both me and the court system. Richard's face, usually so composed and arrogant, fractured. The smirk was gone, replaced by pure, blinding panic. He didn't look at me, he looked at the floor, then at the judge. He knew. He had spent 40 years believing his power, his money, and his facade were impenetrable. But the one piece of old technology he had forgotten about, operated by a 12-year-old girl he deemed irrelevant, was tearing down his carefully constructed kingdom. "Your Honor, this is defamation," Richard roared, abandoning all pretense of legal decorum. He was sputtering now, his voice uncontrolled and high-pitched. "She stole those recordings. They are illegal." Judge Morrison slammed her gavel down once. The sound was deafening. "Mr. Richard, silence. I will remind you that attempting to suborn a medical professional into fabricating a diagnosis to defraud this court of justice is a serious criminal matter. It speaks directly to the credibility of every single piece of medical documentation you have submitted today." Sophia quickly pressed the advantage, presenting the final, damning piece of evidence, the digital draft Richard had stored on the cloud account, outlining his exact strategy to claim I was suffering from early-stage dementia. "Your Honor, the intent is clear. Mr. Richard orchestrated a campaign of emotional and financial abuse, culminating in attempted legal fraud, designed to deny Mrs. Margaret her legal right to marital assets she contributed to for 4 decades. Richard leaned over the table, trying to make eye contact with me, but I didn't give him the satisfaction. I remained the gray rock, the steady observer of his self-immolation. He had spent years telling me I was forgetful and disposable. Now, his attempt to weaponize that lie had backfired spectacularly. Judge Morrison leaned back, reviewing the new filings and the damning transcript provided by Sophia. Her expression, which had been stern, now hardened into icy outrage. "Mr. Richard," she began, her voice measured but lethal, "your conduct here is reprehensible. Not only have you attempted to deceive this court, but you have also inflicted emotional and psychological harm on your wife and attempted to utilize the innocence of your granddaughter's device for surveillance and control." The hammer of justice fell quickly. "I find the evidence submitted by the defense to be entirely discredited by the evidence presented today," Judge Morrison declared. "The documentation regarding Mrs. Margaret's purported cognitive impairment is hereby struck from the record as fraudulent." She looked directly at Richard, who was shrinking visibly in his tailored suit. "I am issuing a temporary restraining order against Mr. Richard, prohibiting contact with both Mrs. Margaret and the minor child, Lily, effective immediately, given the stated intent to surveil and manipulate. Furthermore, based on the conversations presented regarding financial manipulation and medical fraud, I am referring this entire matter to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution." Richard inhaled sharply, a wounded sound. His lawyer frantically tried to consult with him, but Richard slapped his hand away. He was ruined. The financial fraud was one thing, but the public exposure of his cruelty and the threat of criminal charges for medical falsification, that was the nuclear option. Judge Morrison finished without looking at Richard again. "Considering the length of the marriage, Mrs. Margaret's demonstrable support of the marital estate, and the proven malicious intent of Mr. Richard to deny her equitable division, the request for equal asset division is granted. Mrs. Margaret will receive 50% of all marital assets, effective immediately." As the bailiff approached Richard's side, presumably to escort him out and serve the restraining order, Richard finally looked at me. His eyes were not angry, but empty, the shock of total defeat. I simply met his gaze, holding the silence, letting him see the Margaret who was finally free. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't lost my temper, and I hadn't needed to apologize for wanting lunch with my sister. I had simply presented the truth he tried to bury, and the entire courtroom saw Richard for the abusive fraud he truly was. The silence that followed was no longer cold and suffocating, it was the blessed sound of my emancipation. 2 years later, I sat on my balcony, a cup of strong coffee steaming beside me. The morning air in my new neighborhood was crisp, scented with blooming jasmine, not the sterile, expensive grandeur of Richard's former estate. 2 years. 40 years of subjugation had been swept away by 90 minutes of unvarnished truth in a courtroom. I was now Margaret, age 64, and the view from my condo wasn't just pretty, it was mine. Below me, through the open sliding door, I could see the light spilling into my private art studio, a room I had insisted upon when I purchased the property. My easel stood ready, waiting for me to finish the landscape I started yesterday, a piece inspired by the impromptu trip to Italy Jennifer and I took last spring. The final financial details were resolved quickly after Judge Morrison's ruling. Richard fought the 50% division, naturally, but the looming criminal investigation tied his hands. Facing charges for attempted fraud and witness tampering, by trying to coerce a doctor, Richard's priority shifted from clinging to assets to maintaining his freedom. He eventually settled, terrified of a public criminal trial that would utterly dismantle his business and reputation. The half of the marital assets wasn't just a monetary settlement, it was my independence. I wasn't just provided for, I was financially autonomous for the first time in my adult life. I invested wisely, ensuring the money Richard had scoffed at me for not earning was now working for me. The biggest joy, though, was the restoration of my spirit. Painting was no longer a nostalgic hobby but a passion. I started attending classes, connecting with artists, and living the life I had shelved at 22. Richard had always insisted my dreams could wait. 2 years ago, I finally realized they had waited long enough. My relationship with Lily, my fearless granddaughter, was deeper than ever. She saw the transformation in me, the slow shedding of the fear and the nervous energy Richard had instilled. She often reminded me that she was merely the messenger, but I knew her courage had been the key. "You know, Grandma," she told me recently, her eyes bright as she worked on her high school debate preparation, "watching Richard's face change when your voice came out of that speaker, that was the best lesson in jurisprudence a kid could ask for. He thought the rules only applied to everyone else." Lily's new ambition? She now wants to be a lawyer, specifically focused on family law, determined to help women who are trapped in financially abusive relationships. She saw the law not just as rules, but as a weapon for justice, and she was inspired to wield it. And Richard? The universe has a cruel sense of irony for those who confuse control with strength. The criminal charges were ultimately settled with a plea deal, saving him from jail time but hitting his reputation fatally. His business, dependent on his pristine public image, crumbled quickly under the weight of the scandal and the massive asset division. The last I heard, he was living in a dreary, corporate apartment, having downsized multiple times, selling off the luxury cars and even the house I spent 40 years perfecting. The restraining order ensured I never had to see his miserable face again, but Jennifer keeps an eye on the news. Richard is no longer the titan of industry, he is merely a footnote, a cautionary tale about a powerful man brought low by his own malice. He is alone, stripped of the audience he needed to validate his existence. "He took care of me," he used to say. Now, there is no one left to take care of him. As I stand up now, stretching my shoulders, I feel the lightness of true freedom. Richard tried to convince the court I was forgetful and mentally unstable. He tried to frame my desire for autonomy as a symptom of mental decline. But in the end, his own abusive words were his undoing. I walk into my bright, sunny studio. I pick up a brush, the scent of oil paint filling the air. This life, built on integrity and courage, is immeasurably richer than the opulent prison Richard built. The silence in the courtroom 2 years ago was my emancipation, the silence in my studio today is my peace. I was right to burn his perfect world down, because in the ashes, I finally found myself.